Hello, my fellow Scottish clansmen. We are back with another video, and today we will be talking about a movie famously riddled with inaccuracies, Braveheart. Braveheart is a very critically acclaimed movie, winning an astounding 5 Academy Awards. But even with the movie winning these prestigious awards, many history lovers have had a hard time enjoying this movie because of the various historical inconsistencies that plague this movie. So, as always, we will first start with analyzing the inaccuracies, and then we will go over the accuracies. Also, this video contains spoilers for Braveheart, so if you haven't seen it, go watch it first before watching this video. And also, this video is going to run a little bit longer than the typical length of my How Historically Accurate Was videos, because there is a lot of inaccuracies to unpack in this movie. Now then, hold on to your kilts and clean your bagpipes as we charge into this fascinating Scottish adventure. Before we get into all the inaccuracies, I just want to lay out the picture as to why Braveheart is so historically inaccurate. It is because it is mainly based off of a Scottish poem, mostly referred to as The Wallace by Blind Harry, that deeply romanticizes the events of the First Scottish War of Independence and William Wallace's life. The poem even names his wife as Marion Braidfoot, which is considered by most historians to be wrong, and that Mary, Queen of Scots, paid Blind Harry to include her as his husband because she was related to Marion Braidfoot. So Mary, Queen of Scots, pretty much thought it would be a neat idea if she could convince everybody that she was related to the big Scottish hero William Wallace. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, we will get into the rest of the inaccuracies. Right off the bat, from the opening narration, we have our first inaccuracy, as it states that the King of England, Edward I, played by Patrick McGowan, is a pagan, which I have to say is a real bonehead move from the writers. Even though at one point the Anglo-Saxons who lived on the British Isles were pagans, most of them converted to Christianity by the 6th and 7th centuries. So with Christianity being the most popular religion for centuries by the time of the movie, it is pretty hard to sell this fact even to an audience that just knows a little bit about the history of England. That the King of England was a pagan during this time period? Especially since the real Edward I went on the 9th Crusade, which was also called Lord Edward's Crusade. Now I get that the writers were Christian, and they were thinking that if they made the English pagans, they would look more evil and stuff like that. But I don't know, I feel like you can still pull it off with the King of England being Christian. Next, the film states that Malcolm Wallace was the father of William Wallace. In reality, historians are actually torn on whether or not his father was named Malcolm or Alan, as there is good evidence to suggest it could be either one. And there is also just the fact that we don't really know much about any of William Wallace's family. The film also shows William having one brother, but there is evidence that suggests the real William Wallace had 2 brothers. Also, it states that William is born into a family of commoners, but actually he was born into a minor noble family. In the scene where William, his father, and his brother are in the house where Edward I kills many Scottish nobles during a meeting never happened. There is also no records of William Wallace's father dying in a battle against Edward I's army, like the film shows. The origin of the use and the invention of bagpipes is still hotly debated, as there is some speculation that bagpipes were used in the 11th century, and maybe even as early as the 2nd century, but they most likely didn't appear or just wasn't popularized in Scotland until the 15th century. The film then tells us that Edward I's eldest son is to be married to the Princess of France. There are two things wrong with this. The first being that Edward I's eldest son was actually named John, and he did not take the throne, as he died at a very young age. In fact, most of Edward I's sons died very young, except for his fourth son, Edward II. And the second thing is that Princess Isabella of France, who married Edward II, would have been around 1 year old by the time of the First Scottish War of Independence, which broke out in 1296 CE. Then Edward I declares prima nocta, which means that the English lords have sexual rights to Scottish women on their wedding night. In actuality, Edward did not declare this, and it is even debated by many historians whether or not prima nocta was ever really used, as there is such a lack of evidence of its use throughout medieval Europe. The love interest of William Wallace in the film is named Murren, but in real life it is debated whether or not William Wallace was ever even married in the first place. The scene where Wallace starts fighting the English for the first time because his wife Murren is killed by the English sheriff is actually a pretty accurate portrayal of what happened during the action at Lanark. And I will talk about these accuracies soon, of course, but what is not accurate was that he did it because the English sheriff killed his wife. Now, there is not a lot we know about the action at Lanark, but one primary source gives us a good picture of what possibly happened, and that is the fight broke out between Wallace's men and the English sheriff's men when the sheriff was holding a court, presumably against Wallace, in which Wallace was able to escape and come back with some men. And that is when the fight ensued. The first scene showing Robert the Bruce's father, who was also named Robert, as a leper is somewhat inaccurate, as he was known to be very ill later in his life, but there are no accounts that say that he had leprosy. Then, probably one of the craziest inaccuracies of the film is when Edward I is shown throwing his son's advisor out of a window, which is supposed to have been the film's portrayal of Piers Gaveston. This, of course, never happened. Gaveston was killed many years after Edward I's death by English nobles that thought he was too close to King Edward II, which was hurting their influence in English politics. The first big battle scene in Braveheart is supposedly inspired by the Battle of Stirling Bridge, which was the first major battle of the First War of Scottish Independence. There is a lot of problems with this battle in the film, so just bear with me here. First of all, the most glaring inaccuracy is there's no bridge. How can you have a Battle of Stirling Bridge with no bridge? I mean, come on, guys. I can see how you can get everything else wrong and change it to fit a narrative, but you couldn't even put a bridge in the background or something? Never mind, forget it, guys. Everything in Braveheart isn't fake, actually, okay? It is completely accurate, except for this horse. This horse is completely fake. Alright, sorry, I'm getting off topic. So them wearing blue and white face paint is not accurate either, as that is more of a thing the Picts did during the early Middle Ages and Roman to pre-Roman periods of Scottish history. Also, none of the Scottish people were wearing metal plate armor, or even chainmail, just kilts and leather armor, which is very inaccurate, as the Scottish were definitely a bit better equipped, armor-wise. though maybe not as much as the English were, but still. And kilts were not worn in Scotland until the late 17th or early 18th century, so that is also a big inaccuracy as well. When the Irish and Scottish charge at each other during the depiction of the Battle of Falkirk, the Irish switch sides, betraying the English and fighting with the Scottish. This is not accurate, and there really isn't any evidence that suggests the Irish troops were involved in the battle on either side. Even though it is in the realm of possibility that Edward I paid off the Scottish lords to not charge into battle, like in the film, there is no real evidence that they did it because they were paid off. In fact, many historians suggest that the nobles just thought the battle was lost, so they decided to retreat, not because they were actively betraying William Wallace. This also includes the betrayal of Robert the Bruce, which there is no evidence that suggests Robert the Bruce ever betrayed Wallace, at least not publicly. After Wallace is betrayed in the movie by the nobles, he goes on a silly revenge tour and kills some of the nobles who betrayed him. This, of course, never happened, as the real William Wallace didn't have time to go on a silly revenge mission, and also, like I said before, it was unclear whether or not the nobles actually betrayed him at Falkirk. Then Wallace goes to a meeting with Robert the Bruce and the other lords in the movie. He is betrayed by them and captured and thrown into English custody, and even though Wallace was captured near Glasgow in 1305 CE, in real life there is no evidence that it was Robert the Bruce or the high nobility of Scotland. It was actually another knight named John Menteith. Before Wallace's execution in the film, there is a scene where Princess Isabella tells Edward I on his deathbed that she is pregnant with a child not of his line, which is William Wallace's child. This whole scene is wildly inaccurate, as Isabella would have been 10 years old and not married to Edward II yet, so there is no way any of this could have happened. The movie also depicts a less gruesome execution of William Wallace than what happened in real life, and I cannot tell you anything about it if I want to keep this channel even a bit family friendly. So if you're really interested, just go Google it. Also, during the end of the execution in the film, it shows Edward I dead. In reality, Edward I lived a little bit more than 2 years after Wallace's execution. At the end of the film, it says the Scottish won their freedom in 1314 CE. This is only partially true, as the Scottish did win a crucial victory at the Battle of Bannockburn. But it wasn't until 1328 CE when the Treaty of Edinburgh and Northampton was signed by both parties, formally giving Scotland its independence. Also, one last tidbit I want to add is that one prominent figure that is left out is Andrew Moray. Moray was a nobleman who had merged his army with William Wallace's army, and they both jointly led the new formed army. Alright, wow, that was a lot of inaccuracies. Now to get on to the accuracies. Our first accuracy is the way Edward I is portrayed in the film. Patrick McGowan's performance is fantastic as Edward I, as he really captures that essence of what Edward I probably would have acted like in real life. Though he is probably a bit more evil in the film, as like I said earlier, Edward I never threw anyone out of a window, and there is no evidence that suggests he was ever cruel to his son Edward II. Also, going back to what I said earlier, the action at Lanark is pretty accurately depicted, minus the wife-killing motive behind it. Except for the scene where William Wallace is shattered by the fact that Robert the Bruce betrayed him during the Battle of Falkirk. The film depicts Robert the Bruce and his father trying to play both sides pretty well, as the real Robert the Bruce was fairly on the fence trying to figure out which side would ultimately succeed before choosing that side. During the Battle of Stirling Bridge, the movie very accurately portrays the way heavy cavalry would have been used, and how scary it would have been to fight a heavy cavalry charge. Even the tactics the Scottish used to counteract the heavy cavalry charge, using long spears, is an accurate battle tactic the Scottish used during the war. These long spear tactics were called schiltrons. The film's depiction of the Scottish using farming tools as weapons is probably fairly accurate. Even though they were more well-equipped than Braveheart shows, there were some that did need to improvise. Even though Wallace was born to a minor noble family, he was knighted and made guardian of the Kingdom of Scotland, just like in the film, though it isn't really clear who would have knighted him in real life. The movie's depiction of William Wallace being captured by the English and put on trial and sentenced to death is mostly accurate. Even the scene where Wallace says, "I never recognized Edward I as my king," was the defense William Wallace actually used during his trial. I will say, even though Braveheart is plagued with so many inaccuracies, it does portray a real sense of freedom that these people were fighting for, and what that would have felt like to the real Scottish people who were fighting for something bigger than themselves. Well, my Highland brothers and sisters, we have reached the end of this inspiring video. Did I leave out any inaccuracies or accuracies you find interesting about Braveheart? And if so, don't be afraid to take out your red-hot Scottish rage in the comment section below, and thanks for watching.